England, 1852. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Valahart Manor like a shroud of forgotten memories, curling around ancient oak trees that had witnessed generations of prosperity and decay. The estate itself stood proud against the pale dawn sky, its stone walls weathered by time but still imposing, still defiant. Within those walls lived the remnants of a family that had once commanded respect across 3 counties, now reduced to shadows of their former glory, clinging to old grudges as though they were treasures worth preserving. Elowen Valehart stood at her bedroom window, her fingers tracing the condensation on the glass as she watched the sun struggle to break through the grey English sky. She had learned long ago that mornings like these carried an omen, though she could never quite decipher what the universe was trying to tell her. Her reflection stared back at her from the window, a young woman of 23 with auburn hair that caught fire in whatever light dared to touch it, and eyes the colour of moss after rain. Her mother used to say she had inherited the Valehart stubbornness, but none of their cruelty, an observation that had always felt more like an accusation than a compliment. The house was stirring below her. She could hear the servants preparing breakfast, their footsteps echoing through halls that seemed too large for the family that remained. Her brother Edmund would be in his study already, poring over ledgers that told the story of their diminishing fortune, his jaw set in that familiar expression of bitter determination. Her father had died 3 winters ago, taking with him whatever warmth had once existed in this house, leaving behind only the cold legacy of a feud that nobody could quite explain anymore. Everyone knew the history, of course. The Drakewells and the Valeharts had been at odds for as long as anyone could remember, though the exact nature of the original transgression had been lost to time, replaced by layers of perceived slights and deliberate insults. Something about land rights, perhaps, or a broken betrothal generations ago. Whatever spark had ignited this particular fire had long since been consumed by the flames it created, but the hatred continued to burn with the devotion of a religious observance. Elowen had never understood it. She found the entire situation absurd, this dedication to maintaining animosity toward people they barely knew, simply because their ancestors had deemed it necessary. But Edmund wore the feud like armor, and their mother, in her final days, had whispered warnings about the Drakewell treachery with her dying breath. Elowen had held her hand and promised to remember, though she had no intention of letting old poison contaminate whatever remained of her life. A commotion from the courtyard drew her attention. She leaned closer to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to make out what was happening. Several servants had gathered near the main gate, their postures suggesting alarm rather than routine morning activity. Then she saw him. The rider approached on a massive black stallion that moved with predatory grace, its coat gleaming like polished obsidian even in the weak morning light. But it was the man astride the beast who commanded attention, his presence so commanding that even from this distance, Elowen felt something shift in the air around her. He wore a dark riding coat that emphasized broad shoulders, and even from her window she could see the way he held himself, as though he owned not just the horse beneath him, but the very ground it walked upon. She didn't need to see his face to know who he was. Theron Drakewell, Duke of Blackridge, the man whose name was spoken in hushed tones within these walls, always accompanied by warnings and barely concealed hatred. He was the current keeper of the Drakewell legacy, inheritor of their wealth and their grudges in equal measure. Edmund had mentioned him recently, his voice tight with frustration as he recounted some business matter that had gone poorly, though Elowen had stopped listening, weary of hearing about problems she couldn't solve and feuds she didn't want to inherit. Her heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't have explained why. Perhaps it was simple fear, the natural response to seeing the enemy at your gates, or perhaps it was something else, something she didn't want to examine too closely. The Duke dismounted with fluid grace, handing his reins to a groom who approached with visible nervousness. Even the servants knew what his presence meant. Nothing good had ever come from a Drakewell visiting Valehart Manor, and nothing good was likely to come from this visit either. Elowen pulled away from the window, suddenly aware that she was still in her morning dress, her hair unpinned and falling in waves down her back. She shouldn't care what she looked like, not for him, not for any Drakewell. But her hands moved to her hair anyway, automatically beginning to arrange it into something more presentable, a habit ingrained by years of her mother's instruction about proper appearance. The knock on her door came quickly, sharp and urgent. "Miss Elowen," called Martha, her lady's maid, her voice pitched high with anxiety. "Mr. Edmund requests your presence in the drawing-room immediately. The Duke of Blackridge has arrived." "I know," Elowen replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Tell my brother I'll be down shortly." She dressed quickly, choosing a morning gown of deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, telling herself that her choice had nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with maintaining the dignity of the Valahart name. If they were to be confronted by their enemy, they would at least face him looking composed and unafraid, even if the latter was something of a performance. The drawing room was on the ground floor, a space that had once been grand, but now showed signs of neglect, like everything else in the house. The furniture was still fine but outdated, and there was a persistent dampness to the air that no amount of fires could quite dispel. Edmund was already there when Elowen entered, standing near the fireplace with his arms crossed, his expression thunderous. "What is he doing here?" Elowen asked quietly, moving to stand beside her brother. "I have no idea," Edmund replied through clenched teeth. "But nothing good, you can be certain of that. The man has never darkened our doorway without leaving destruction in his wake." "When has he ever been here before?" Elowen asked, genuinely curious. She couldn't recall any previous visit, though perhaps it had happened before she was old enough to remember. "Not him specifically," Edmund admitted. "But his father came once when I was a boy. There was some dispute about water rights, I think. He threatened legal action, made accusations about our family's honor. Father was furious for weeks afterward." Before Elowen could respond, the door opened and their butler, Preston, announced in his most formal tone, "His Grace, the Duke of Blackridge." The man who entered the drawing room seemed to fill it entirely, despite the generous proportions of the space. Theron Drakewell was taller than Elowen had anticipated, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead in a way that suggested he cared little for current fashions. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, the face of a man who had learned early that softness was a liability. But it was his eyes that captured her attention, grey as storm clouds and just as turbulent, holding an intelligence that suggested he missed very little. Those eyes swept the room with calculated precision, taking in every detail before finally settling on Edmund with an expression that revealed nothing. "Mr. Valahart," the Duke said, his voice deep and controlled, carrying the kind of authority that came from never being questioned. "Thank you for receiving me." "I wasn't aware I had a choice," Edmund replied coolly. "When a duke arrives unannounced at one's home, one can hardly turn him away." A ghost of something, perhaps amusement, flickered across the Duke's features. "How very diplomatic of you. Though we both know you would have refused me entry, if you could have managed it without causing a scandal." Edmund's jaw tightened. "State your business, Your Grace. I have matters to attend to." "I am certain you do," the Duke replied, his tone suggesting he found Edmund's matters of little consequence. Then his gaze shifted, landing on Elowen with such sudden intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elowen found herself unable to look away, caught in those grey eyes that seemed to see through every defense she had carefully constructed. There was something in his expression that startled her, a flicker of surprise, as though he had expected to find one thing and discovered something entirely different. "And you are?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "My sister, Miss Elowen Valahart," Edmund supplied tersely. "Elowen, this is the Duke of Blackridge, though I suspect you had already deduced that." "Your Grace," Elowen managed, offering a slight curtsy that protocol demanded, even as every instinct told her to flee from the intensity of his regard. "Miss Valahart," he replied, and the way he said her name with careful precision, as though testing the sound of it, made something tighten in her chest. "I had not realized Edmund had a sister. I prefer to avoid the attention of our family's enemies," Elowen replied before she could stop herself, then immediately regretted the tartness of her tone. Whatever this visit was about, antagonizing the Duke would likely make things worse. But instead of taking offense, the Duke's expression shifted into something that might have been respect. A sensible approach, though I wonder if maintaining familial feuds serves anyone's interest these days. "An interesting observation from a Drakewell," Edmund interjected sharply. given that your family has been perpetuating this feud as enthusiastically as mine. Which brings me to why I'm here, the Duke replied, finally pulling his attention away from Elowen and back to Edmund. I've been reviewing some old property documents, and I've discovered something that concerns both our families. More accusations about boundaries, I presume, Edmund said wearily. Your father was always convinced we were encroaching on Drakewell land, despite having no evidence to support such claims. Actually, the Duke said, his voice taking on an edge, I've discovered that the original dispute between our families was based on a considerable misunderstanding. The land my family has been claiming for generations was never rightfully ours. It seems my great-grandfather made an error in his surveying, an error that was never corrected, and one that has cost both our families dearly. The silence that followed this statement was profound. Edmund stared at the Duke as though he had spoken in a foreign language. Elowen felt her mind racing, trying to process what she was hearing. You're saying, Edmund began slowly, that this entire feud, generations of animosity, has been based on a mistake? I'm saying that my family has been in the wrong, the Duke corrected, and the admission seemed to cost him something. The land dispute that started this hatred was founded on Drakewell error, not Veilheart treachery as my family has always claimed. I've brought the documents if you wish to review them. Edmund looked as though someone had struck him. Elowen felt a strange mixture of emotions, primary among them a vindication she hadn't realized she needed. All those years of being told the Drakewells were villains, and here stood their Duke, admitting fault. Why tell us this? Elowen asked, surprising herself by speaking. You could have simply continued as things were. No one would have been the wiser. The Duke's attention returned to her, and again she felt the force of his regard like a physical presence. Because I've grown weary of living in the shadow of my ancestors' mistakes. The feud between our families has cost both sides dearly. I see no reason to continue it based on false premises. How noble of you, Edmund said, though his tone lacked conviction. He seemed genuinely thrown by this revelation, as though the Duke had pulled the foundation out from under his entire worldview. I'm not claiming nobility, the Duke replied evenly. I'm claiming sense. This animosity has served neither of our interests. I propose we end it. Just like that, Edmund asked incredulously. You appear at my door, admit your family has been wrong for generations, and expect me to simply forgive and forget. I expect nothing, the Duke said. I'm offering information and the possibility of peace. What you do with either is entirely your decision. He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather folder, which he placed on the table beside him. The documents are all here. Take whatever time you need to review them. If you have questions, you may send word to Blackridge. He turned as if to leave, but Elowen found herself speaking again, unable to let him walk away without understanding more. Why now? What changed to make you investigate these old claims? The Duke paused, his hand on the door handle, and when he turned back, his expression was different, almost vulnerable in a way that seemed at odds with everything else about him. I lost someone recently, my younger sister. She was thrown from a horse while attempting to jump a fence that marked the boundary between our properties, a fence that existed solely because of this feud. As she lay dying, she asked me why we hated the Veilhearts. I had no answer for her, nothing beyond vague references to family honor and historical grievances. It made me realize how hollow all of this has become. The raw honesty in his voice silenced any response Elowen might have made. She saw Edmund's expression soften slightly, recognizing in the Duke's grief something of their own loss. I'm sorry for your loss, Elowen said quietly. Losing a sibling is a pain I understand all too well. The Duke's eyes met hers, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that transcended the artificial barriers their families had constructed. They were both survivors of senseless loss, both carrying wounds that had nothing to do with ancient feuds, and everything to do with the cruelty of circumstance. Thank you, Miss Veilheart, he said, his voice gentler than it had been. Then to Edmund, I'll await your response. After he left, the drawing room felt strangely empty, as though his presence had been holding up the walls, and now they might collapse inward. Edmund immediately moved to the table and began examining the documents the Duke had left, his brow furrowed in concentration. Elowen found herself moving to the window, watching as the Duke mounted his horse. Just before riding away, he glanced up at the house, and though she stood well back from the window, she could have sworn his eyes found hers. Then he was gone, disappearing down the drive in a thunder of hoofbeats that seemed to echo long after he had vanished from sight. "This changes everything," Edmund muttered, still absorbed in the papers. "Father died believing the Drakewells had stolen from us, that they were the architects of our family's decline. If what these documents show is true, then perhaps we've been holding on to anger that was never justified," Elowen finished. "Edmund, don't you see? This could be an opportunity to finally be free of all this bitterness." Her brother looked up at her, his expression troubled. "Or it could be a trap. How do we know these documents are genuine? He could have forged them, created this entire story to manipulate us somehow." "To what end?" Elowen challenged. "What would he gain from admitting his family was at fault? If anything, it weakens his position, makes him vulnerable to our anger." "I don't know," Edmund admitted, "but I've been raised to suspect everything that comes from a Drakewell. I can't simply cast aside those lessons because of one conversation and some convenient papers." Elowen understood her brother's reluctance, but something in her rebelled against it. She had seen the grief in the Duke's eyes when he spoke of his sister, had heard the sincerity in his voice. Those things couldn't be fabricated, not with such authenticity. Over the following days, Edmund threw himself into investigating the Duke's claims, corresponding with solicitors and land surveyors, determined to verify or disprove everything the Duke had said. Elowen found herself thinking about the encounter more than she should have, her mind returning again and again to those grey eyes and the way they had looked at her, as though seeing something unexpected and intriguing. She tried to dismiss such thoughts as foolish. The Duke of Blackridge was their enemy, or at least he had been until recently. Even if his claims proved true, even if the feud was truly ending, that didn't change the fundamental differences between their families. He was a duke, wealthy and powerful, moving in circles far above Valhart society. She was the sister of a country gentleman whose fortune was dwindling, trapped in a house that felt more like a prison with each passing day. But logic did little to stop her dreams, which had become vivid and troubling since his visit. She would wake in the darkness, her heart racing, fragments of imagined conversations lingering in her mind like ghosts. A week after the Duke's visit, another rider arrived at Valehart Manor, this time carrying an invitation embossed with the Blackridge seal. Edmund read it aloud over breakfast, his tone sceptical. "His Grace the Duke of Blackridge requests the honour of Mr. Edmund Valhart's and Miss Elowen Valhart's presence at dinner tomorrow evening at Blackridge Hall. He wishes to discuss the matters previously addressed and to formally extend his hand in peace." "Absolutely not," Edmund said immediately, tossing the invitation onto the table. "I will not walk into the lion's den at his convenience." "Why not?" Elowen asked, picking up the invitation and examining the elegant script. "You've spent the past week verifying his claims. Have you found any evidence that he was lying?" Edmund's silence was answer enough. His investigations had confirmed everything the Duke had said. The original survey had been flawed, the Drakewell accusations baseless, and generations of animosity built on a foundation of error rather than malice. "That's not the point," Edmund finally said. "Even if he's telling the truth about the past, that doesn't mean he can be trusted now. Men like him don't do anything without an ulterior motive." "Men like him?" Elowen repeated. "You mean wealthy men, powerful men, or just Drakewells?" "All of the above," Edmund replied stubbornly. "I know you've lived a sheltered life, Elowen, but you must understand that people at his level don't think like we do. Everything is strategy, every gesture calculated. This sudden desire for peace, this admission of fault, it all serves some purpose we haven't identified yet. Or perhaps," Elowen suggested carefully, "he's simply a man who's tired of pointless conflict and genuinely wishes to end it." "Is that so impossible to believe?" Edmund studied his sister with an expression that mixed concern with something like pity. "You're too trusting, Elowen. It's one of your better qualities, but also one that could lead to great harm. The Duke of Blackridge is not some romantic figure from one of your novels. He's a powerful man with interests to protect, and we would be fools to forget that." Despite her brother's warnings, Eowyn found herself hoping he would accept the invitation. The idea of seeing the Duke again stirred something in her that she didn't fully understand. A mixture of apprehension and anticipation that felt dangerously like excitement. In the end, Edmund's sense of duty won out over his suspicions. Refusing the invitation would have been seen as cowardice or worse, as confirmation that the Valharts had something to hide. So the next evening found them travelling the 5 miles to Blackridge Hall, their carriage rattling over roads that had rarely carried Valeharts in any peaceful capacity. Blackridge Hall was everything Valehart Manor was not. Where their home showed its age through subtle decay, Blackridge gleamed with maintained grandeur. The approach was lined with ancient oaks that created a cathedral-like canopy overhead, and the house itself rose from perfectly manicured grounds like something from a painting, its pale stone glowing in the evening light. "Impressive," Edmund muttered, though his tone suggested the admission pained him. "I'd forgotten how ostentatious the Drakewells can be." Eowyn said nothing, too absorbed in taking in every detail. She had never been here before, had never imagined she would be. The estate was a manifestation of everything the Drakewell name represented: power, wealth, and a legacy that stretched back further than anyone could remember. They were greeted at the entrance by a butler who looked as though he had been carved from the same stone as the house, all rigid formality and dignified bearing. He led them through halls adorned with portraits of Drakewell ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow the Valehart siblings, with expressions ranging from disdain to curiosity. The Duke was waiting for them in a drawing room that made the equivalent space at Valehart Manor look like a cottage parlour. He stood as they entered, and Eowyn noted that he had dressed formally for the occasion, his evening clothes emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his build. "Mr. Valehart, Miss Valehart," he said, moving forward to greet them. "Thank you for accepting my invitation. I know it required a considerable leap of faith on your part." "Considerable indeed," Edmund replied, though he shook the hand the Duke offered. "I trust you can understand our caution, given the history between our families." "I would expect nothing less," the Duke said. Then his attention shifted to Eowyn, and again she felt that disorienting sensation of being truly seen. "Miss Valehart, I'm pleased you could join us. I hope the journey was not too uncomfortable." "Not at all, Your Grace," Eowyn replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "Your home is beautiful." Something flickered in his expression, something that might have been pleasure at her compliment. "I'm glad you think so, though I confess the beauty is largely inherited rather than earned. My ancestors were the ones with vision. I merely maintain what they created." Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair despite the underlying tension. The Duke proved to be an engaging conversationalist, well-read and thoughtful, with a dry wit that occasionally broke through his formal demeanour. He asked Eowyn about her interests, listened with apparent genuine attention when she spoke of her love for music and literature, and even managed to coax Edmund into a discussion of agricultural improvements that seemed to thaw some of her brother's suspicion. But it was after dinner, when Edmund was distracted examining a particularly fine painting in the gallery, that the Duke drew Eowyn aside with a subtle gesture that suggested this had been his intention all along. "Miss Valehart, would you do me the honour of viewing the rose garden? It's quite spectacular at this hour, and I believe we might benefit from a private conversation." Every lesson her mother had taught her about propriety screamed that she should refuse, that being alone with any man, particularly this man, was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with ancient feuds. But Eowyn found herself nodding, drawn by a force she couldn't quite name. The rose garden was indeed spectacular, a riot of colours and scents contained within ancient stone walls that created a world within a world. The Duke led her down a gravel path lined with blooms that seemed to glow in the fading light, saying nothing until they reached a fountain at the garden's centre. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, turning to face her. "When I came to your home last week, I had expected to find your brother alone. Discovering you there, learning of your existence, it complicated matters in ways I had not anticipated." "I'm not sure I understand," Eowyn replied, though some part of her understood perfectly and was terrified by that understanding. "I think you do," the Duke said quietly. From the moment I saw you, something shifted. All my careful plans, my rational approach to ending this feud, it all became secondary to a single, inconvenient truth. "Which is?" Ellawen asked, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "That I find myself drawn to you in ways that are entirely inappropriate and completely beyond my control," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was almost brutal. "I am not a man given to flights of fancy or romantic notions, Miss Veilhart. I approach life with logic and careful consideration, but you have managed to disrupt all of that with nothing more than your presence." Ellawen felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. She should be offended by his presumption, should remind him of the impropriety of such declarations. Instead, she found herself speaking her own truth. "I have thought of little else but your visit since you left," she confessed. "I told myself it was simple curiosity, that I merely wanted to understand the man who had been presented as our enemy for my entire life. But I know that isn't the whole truth. There was something in the way you looked at me, as though you saw not just the Veilhart name but the person beneath it. No one has ever looked at me that way before." The Duke took a step closer, and Ellawen found she couldn't retreat, didn't want to retreat, even though every rational thought told her this was madness. "This is impossible," he said, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. "Even if we can end the feud between our families, even if we can convince our respective relations that peace is preferable to war, pursuing anything beyond cordiality between us would be seen as the worst kind of betrayal by everyone who matters." "I know," Ellawen replied, "and yet here we stand." "Here we stand," he agreed, and then, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his imposing presence, he reached out and touched her cheek, just the lightest brush of his fingers against her skin. It was barely contact at all, but Ellawen felt it like lightning, a current that ran through her entire body and left her breathless. "Your Grace," she began, but he shook his head. "Theron," he said, "if we're to acknowledge this impossible thing between us, you might as well use my name." "Theron," she repeated, and the intimacy of using his given name felt more daring than anything she had ever done. "What are we doing?" "Complicating everything," he replied with a wry smile. "But I find I don't care as much as I should. Ellawen, I need you to understand something. I am not a good man in the ways that matter. I am hard, often ruthless, and I have made more enemies than friends in my pursuit of protecting Drakewell interests. But since meeting you, I find myself wondering if there might be more to life than duty and obligation." "You barely know me," Ellawen protested weakly. "I know enough," Theron countered. "I know you're intelligent and kind. I know you see the absurdity in our family's feud while still maintaining loyalty to your brother. I know you're brave enough to speak your mind, even when it would be safer to remain silent. Those things tell me more about your character than a dozen formal courtships would reveal." "And what would you have us do with this knowledge?" Ellawen asked. "We cannot simply announce an attachment. Edmund would never forgive me, and your family would likely view me as some kind of opportunist, trying to secure a position above my station." "My family's opinions concern me far less than you might imagine," Theron said. "But you're right about your brother. He will not view this kindly, particularly not now, when trust between our families is so newly established and so fragile. Then what do you propose?" "Time," Theron said. "We take this slowly. Allow our families to become accustomed to peace before introducing the possibility of something more. It will require patience and discretion, neither of which will be easy, given the intensity of what I feel when I'm near you." His words sent warmth flooding through Ellawen's chest. She had never imagined herself the subject of such passion, had always assumed her life would follow a predictable path of moderate contentment at best. The idea that this powerful, compelling man could feel such things for her seemed almost impossible to believe. "And in the meantime?" she asked. "In the meantime, we find excuses to see each other," Theron replied. "I will need to meet with your brother regularly, as we work to formally establish peace between our families and settle the property disputes that have lingered for so long. There will be opportunities for you to be present at those meetings, and perhaps occasionally we might find ourselves in the same social settings, now that open hostility is no longer expected." It wasn't much, but it was more than Eowyn had expected. She nodded, understanding both the promise and the restraint such a plan would require. "We should return to Edmund before he comes looking for us," she said reluctantly. "In a moment," Theron replied, and then, with exquisite care, he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. It was a perfectly proper gesture, the kind that might happen in any formal greeting, but the way his eyes held hers throughout transformed it into something intimate and profound. They walked back to the house in silence, maintaining a carefully appropriate distance, but Eowyn felt as though something fundamental had shifted. She had entered this garden as one person and was leaving as another, someone who now carried a secret that was both thrilling and terrifying. Edmund was where they had left him, though his expression suggested he had noted their absence. "Finished admiring the roses?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. "The garden is quite remarkable," Eowyn replied, proud of how composed she sounded. "His Grace was kind enough to show me the various species his family has cultivated over the years." If Edmund doubted this explanation, he kept his suspicions to himself. The remainder of the evening passed pleasantly enough, with the Duke and Edmund discussing practical matters related to the property disputes, while Eowyn sat quietly, her mind still in the garden, replaying every word that had passed between them. The ride home was conducted in near silence, with Edmund absorbed in his own thoughts and Eowyn grateful for the darkness that hid her expression. It wasn't until they were nearly home that Edmund spoke. "The Duke seems sincere in his desire for peace," he admitted grudgingly. "I had expected some kind of trap, but his proposals regarding the property settlements are more than fair. Indeed, they favor us in several key respects." "Perhaps he simply wishes to correct historical wrongs," Eowyn suggested carefully. "Perhaps," Edmund agreed, though he sounded uncertain. "Or perhaps he has other motivations we haven't yet discerned. I noticed how he looked at you during dinner, Eowyn. I may be your brother, but I'm not blind." Eowyn's heart began to race. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Don't you?" Edmund turned to look at her directly. "The Duke of Blackridge is a wealthy, powerful man who could have his pick of any woman in England. I need you to be cautious, sister. Whatever you might think you see in his attention, remember that men like him view women as assets to be acquired, not partners to be cherished." "You're being unfair," Eowyn protested. "You've barely spoken with him beyond business matters. How can you presume to know his character?" "Because I know what men do when they want something," Edmund replied, "and I recognize the look in his eyes when he watches you. I'm not saying his interest isn't genuine, but I am saying that genuine interest from a duke rarely leads to anything good for women in your position. Promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," Eowyn said, though she wasn't entirely certain what she was promising or if she could keep such a vow. Over the weeks that followed, Theron's prediction proved accurate. His business with Edmund required regular meetings, and while they were held at Valehart Manor more often than not, there were occasions when Edmund was required to travel to Blackridge Hall, and he began bringing Eowyn with him, whether from a desire for company during the journey, or from an inability to deny her when she expressed interest in the proceedings. Each visit became an exercise in restraint. Theron and Eowyn were never alone together, not properly, but they found ways to communicate through glances and brief exchanges that carried more meaning than their mundane words suggested. She learned to read his moods in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hand would tighten almost imperceptibly on his pen when she entered a room. He learned that she twisted the ring on her right hand when she was nervous, and that her smile had different gradations, each revealing something about her inner state. They were falling in love, Eowyn realized, in the most complicated and inconvenient way possible. Each meeting left her wanting more. Each separation felt like a small death. She lay awake at night imagining conversations they might have, touches they might share, futures that seemed impossibly distant. Edmund noticed, of course. He said nothing directly, but Eowyn felt his watchful gaze during their visits to Blackridge, saw the concern in his expression when she was too quiet on the journey home. He was trying to protect her, she knew, from the kind of heartbreak that seemed inevitable given the circumstances. But the heart, Eowyn was discovering, cared little for logic or propriety. She was in love with Theron Drakewell, Duke of Blackridge, heir to their family's enemy, and there seemed to be nothing she could do to stop the feeling from growing stronger with each passing day. The turning point came during a visit to Blackridge that had ostensibly been arranged to finalize certain documents related to the property settlement. Edmund had brought Elowen along as usual, though he had seemed distracted throughout the journey, his mind clearly occupied by other matters. The meeting was brief, with most of the actual work having been completed by solicitors in advance. All that remained was for Edmund and Theron to sign various papers and shake hands on agreements that formally ended generations of disputes. It should have been a moment of triumph for both families, the achievement of peace that had seemed impossible just months earlier. But as they stood in Theron's study, Edmund signing his name with careful precision, Elowen felt an inexplicable sense of dread. Something was wrong, though she couldn't have said what. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy she didn't understand. "There's something else we need to discuss," Edmund said as he set down his pen. His voice was tight, controlled in a way that suggested he was containing some strong emotion. Theron looked up, his expression wary. "What matter is that?" Edmund drew a folded letter from his coat pocket, placing it on the desk between them with deliberate care. "I received this 3 days ago. It's from a solicitor in London, a man who specializes in genealogical research. I had commissioned him months ago before your visit, when I was still intent on finding some legal avenue to reclaim what I believed the Drakewells had stolen from us." "Edmund," Elowen said quietly, sensing disaster approaching. "Perhaps this isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," her brother interrupted, his eyes never leaving Theron's face. "This letter contains information that changes everything. It seems our family's connection runs far deeper than a simple land dispute." Theron's expression had gone carefully blank, the mask of a man preparing for impact. "Go on." "According to documents this solicitor uncovered," Edmund continued, his voice gaining an edge, "our families were once united by marriage. Your great-great-grandmother was born Elizabeth Veilhart. She married into the Drakewell family, bringing with her a substantial dowry that included the very lands our families have been fighting over for generations." The silence that followed was absolute. Elowen felt her breath catch, understanding the implications even before Edmund continued. "The land was never Drakewell property," Edmund said, his voice rising slightly. "It was Veilhart land, given as part of Elizabeth's marriage settlement with the explicit provision that it would remain in the Veilhart name, to be passed down through her children. But when Elizabeth died young, leaving only a daughter, the Drakewells refused to honor the agreement. They claimed the land as their own, and when my ancestors challenged them, they fabricated a survey dispute to muddy the waters and make it seem as though our family was the aggressor. Theron had gone very still, his face pale. "Let me see the documents." Edmund pushed the letter across the desk. "It's all there. Copies of the original marriage contract, testimony from witnesses who were silenced, correspondence that shows your family knew exactly what they were doing when they took what wasn't theirs." Elowen watched Theron read, saw his expression shift from disbelief to something darker as he absorbed the information. When he finally looked up, his eyes had gone cold, distant in a way that made her heart ache. "If this is accurate," he said slowly, "then everything I told you about the survey error, about my family's innocent mistake, was wrong. Not a lie, because I believed it to be true, but wrong nonetheless. The deception goes back further and runs deeper than I had imagined. Which means your gesture of peace, your admission of fault, was based on incomplete information," Edmund said, his tone harsh. "What happens now, Your Grace? Do you still stand by your commitment to return what was taken? Or does discovering that the theft was deliberate rather than accidental change your position?" It was a test, Elowen realized. Edmund was challenging Theron to prove that his intentions were genuine, that he was different from the ancestors who had committed this original sin. Theron stood abruptly, moving to the window and staring out at his estate with an expression of profound weariness. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been grief. "I cannot change what my family did. I cannot undo the harm they caused or restore the years your family spent fighting a wrong they couldn't prove. But I can do what I should have done from the beginning, had I known the full truth. The land in question, all of it, reverts to Valahart control immediately. I'll have my solicitors draw up the documents transferring the title." "Just like that?" Edmund asked, suspicion evident in his tone. "You'll simply hand over property worth a considerable fortune because of documents that could potentially be forgeries?" "They're not forgeries," Theron replied, turning back to face them. "I can see the truth in them, can recognize the patterns of deception my family has always excelled at employing. My father was a master of legal manipulation, and his father before him. Why should I doubt they were capable of this? The real question is why I didn't investigate more thoroughly before, why I was content to accept the version of history that painted my family as victims of circumstance rather than architects of theft." He looked directly at Elowen then, and she saw pain in his eyes, pain and something else, something that looked like resignation. "I understand if this changes things between our families. The peace we were building was founded on the belief that the original wrong was a mistake rather than a deliberate act. Learning that your family has been fighting a justified battle all along rather than perpetuating a pointless feud, it shifts the moral ground considerably." "It does," Edmund agreed, "but I'm not interested in returning to hostility, even if we would now be justified in doing so. What I want is acknowledgement, formal and public, that the Valahart family has been wronged by the Drakewells for generations. I want the record corrected, the truth known. Can you give me that?" Theron nodded slowly. "I can. I will make a formal statement acknowledging the historical wrong and my family's role in perpetuating it. You'll have your vindication, Mr. Valahart. It's the least I can do." "Good," Edmund said, though his expression remained troubled. "Then I think we're finished here. Elowen, we should go." But Elowen found she couldn't move, couldn't simply walk away when she could see the devastation in Theron's face. He looked like a man who had been shown the true nature of his inheritance and found it wanting, who had discovered that the legacy he had been taught to honor was built on cruelty and deception. "Edmund, could you give me a moment?" she asked quietly. "I'd like to speak with His Grace privately." Her brother's expression darkened. "Elowen, that wouldn't be appropriate." "I don't care about appropriate," she replied, with more force than she had intended. "I care about speaking my mind before we leave. Surely you can grant me that small courtesy." Edmund looked between his sister and the Duke, and whatever he saw in their faces seemed to confirm his worst suspicions. "5 minutes," he said finally. "I'll wait in the hall." After the door closed behind him, Elowen moved closer to Theron, though she stopped short of touching him, uncertain of her welcome. "You couldn't have known," she said softly. "This isn't your fault." "Isn't it?" Theron replied bitterly. "I am the inheritor of everything the Drakewell name represents, the money that pays for this estate, the power I wield in society. All of it is built on what my family took from yours, and from countless others, no doubt. How many other disputes might have similarly dark origins if I bothered to investigate?" "You're investigating now," Elowen pointed out. "You're choosing to confront these truths rather than ignore them. That requires courage." "Or it's the minimum requirement for decency," Theron countered. He finally looked at her fully, and the anguish in his expression made her heart clench. "Elowen, I need you to understand something. What I told you in the garden, about what I feel for you, that hasn't changed. If anything, learning this makes those feelings more complicated but no less real. But I also understand that pursuing anything between us now would be unconscionable. Your family has every right to hate mine, and you would be betraying your own blood if you were to align yourself with me." "That's not your decision to make," Elowen replied, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "I am not a child who needs protection from her own feelings. I know what your family did, what they took from mine, but I also know you, Theron. I know the man you are, not the legacy you inherited, and that man is worth fighting for." "You shouldn't have to fight for me," Theron said quietly. "You deserve someone whose name doesn't carry the weight of ancestral crimes, someone your family could welcome without reservation." "Perhaps," Elowen agreed. "But since when do we get what we deserve rather than what we choose? I choose you, Theron. If you'll have me despite all the complications and impossibilities, I choose you." For a moment, Theron looked as though he might argue further. Then something in his expression crumbled, and he closed the distance between them in 2 strides, pulling her into an embrace that felt like both a beginning and an ending. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against her hair. "But I'm too selfish to let you go." They stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other's presence. Then reality intruded in the form of Edmund clearing his throat from the doorway. "Your time is up," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Ellawen, we need to leave." She pulled away from Theron reluctantly, aware of how this must look to her brother, how damning the evidence of their embrace would be. But when she turned to face Edmund, she met his gaze steadily, refusing to show shame for something that felt so fundamentally right. "We need to talk," Edmund said, looking at his sister with an expression that mixed concern with something like betrayal. "In the carriage. Now." The ride home was as uncomfortable as Ellawen had anticipated. Edmund sat in rigid silence for the first mile, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded. "Since the beginning," Ellawen admitted. "Since the first moment he came to our home. I know you don't want to hear this, Edmund, but I'm in love with him." "In love?" Edmund repeated, his voice dripping with disbelief. "Ellawen, you barely know the man. You've exchanged a few conversations, shared some charged glances, and now you think you're in love." "I know him better than you think," Ellawen replied. "I've watched how he conducts himself, how he treats his servants, how he's willing to confront uncomfortable truths about his family even when it costs him. Those things tell me more about his character than any formal courtship could." "His character," Edmund said bitterly. "The man whose family deliberately stole from ours, who we now know have been lying for generations. That's the character you're defending." "He didn't steal anything," Ellawen shot back. "He inherited a situation he didn't create and has been trying his best to correct it. Should he be punished forever for the sins of his ancestors? No, but he should have the basic decency to leave my sister alone," Edmund replied. "Can't you see what this looks like? The Duke of Blackridge suddenly interested in reconciliation, suddenly eager to make amends, and conveniently falling for the sister of the man he's wronged. It's too perfectly calculated." "You think he's manipulating me?" Ellawen asked, genuinely hurt by the suggestion. "I think he's a powerful man who's learned that sometimes honey catches more flies than vinegar," Edmund said. "If he can secure your affections, he gains leverage over our entire family. You become a tool he can use to ensure we don't press our advantage now that we know the truth." "That's a horrible thing to say," Ellawen whispered. "It's a realistic thing to say," Edmund corrected. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Ellawen. I'm trying to protect you from being hurt far worse down the line. Men like the Duke don't marry women like us, not really. We're not important enough, not connected enough. At best, you'd become his mistress, hidden away and ashamed. At worst, he'll use you until you're no longer useful and discard you without a second thought." His words hit like physical blows, each one landing with precision on Ellawen's deepest fears. But beneath the pain, anger bloomed hot and righteous. "You don't know him," she said fiercely. "You've decided who he is based on his title and his family name without giving him a chance to prove himself different. That makes you just as prejudiced as those who would judge me for my lesser station." "I'm being practical," Edmund insisted. "Someone in this family needs to be." They spoke no more for the remainder of the journey, each lost in their own turbulent thoughts. By the time they reached Valeheart Manor, Ellawen felt exhausted, wrung out by the emotional upheaval of the day. She retreated to her room, declining dinner with the excuse of a headache that was not entirely fabricated. Martha helped her undress and prepare for bed, but sleep proved elusive. Ellawen lay in the darkness, replaying the day's events, trying to find a path forward that didn't require her to choose between her family and her heart. The answer came in an unexpected form 3 days later, when Theron himself arrived at Valeheart Manor, requesting an audience with Edmund. Ellawen watched from the upstairs window as her brother reluctantly admitted him, their body language suggesting this was not a friendly visit. She waited in her room, fighting the urge to rush downstairs and insert herself into whatever conversation was happening. It felt like an eternity before Martha appeared at her door, slightly breathless. "Miss Ellawen, your brother requests your presence in the drawing room. The Duke is still here." Ellawen's heart began to race. She took a moment to compose herself, checking her reflection and smoothing her dress before descending the stairs with as much dignity as she could muster. Both men stood as she entered the drawing room. Edmund looked grim, while Theron's expression was unreadable, though she could see tension in the set of his shoulders. "Elouan," Edmund began, his voice strained, "the Duke has made a rather extraordinary request, one that I feel you should hear directly from him." Theron stepped forward, and Elouan noticed he was holding something, a small box that he turned over and over in his hands, as though drawing courage from the repetitive motion. "Miss Veilhart," he began, and the formality of his address sent a chill through her. "I came here today to speak with your brother about something I should have addressed openly from the start. I've been dishonest, not in facts, but in omission, and that dishonesty has created complications that could have been avoided with more courage on my part." "I don't understand," Elouan said, though dread was already pooling in her stomach. "I'm in love with you," Theron said simply. "I have been since the moment I first saw you, and that love has only grown stronger with each encounter. I've tried to be patient, to give our families time to adjust to peace before introducing the possibility of something more between us, but recent events have made it clear that waiting is no longer an option." He took a breath, and Elouan realized with shock that he was nervous. This powerful duke was actually nervous about what he was about to say. "I've come to ask your brother's permission to court you officially, with the intention of marriage, if you'll have me." The silence that followed was deafening. Elouan felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. This was everything she had wanted and feared in equal measure, offered in the most public and irrevocable way possible. "You want to marry my sister," Edmund said slowly, as though testing the words to see if they made any more sense spoken aloud. "The Duke of Blackridge wishes to marry into the family his own family has wronged for generations." "I wish to marry Elouan," Theron corrected. "The fact that doing so would unite our families is a consideration, but it's not my primary motivation. I love her, Mr. Veilhart. She is intelligent, kind, brave, and sees the world with a clarity that I've never encountered before. I would count myself the most fortunate of men if she would consent to be my wife." "And you think I would agree to this?" Edmund asked, his voice rising. "You think I would hand my sister over to a Drakewell even now knowing what I know?" "I think I'm giving you the choice," Theron replied evenly. "I could have pursued Elouan secretly, could have convinced her to elope, or meet me in ways that would have compromised her reputation beyond repair. I didn't do those things because I respect her too much, and because I understand that any future we build must have a foundation of honesty, even when that honesty is uncomfortable." He turned to Elouan, and the naked emotion in his face took her breath away. "You said you choose me despite everything. I'm here to ask if you meant it. Will you allow me to court you properly? Will you give me the chance to prove that I can be the man you deserve?" Every eye in the room was on her. This was the moment, Elouan realized, where her life would split into two distinct possibilities. She could refuse, could maintain family loyalty and avoid the complications that would certainly come from aligning herself with a Drakewell. It would be the safe choice, the expected choice. Or she could leap into the unknown with a man who had proven himself willing to confront uncomfortable truths, who had looked at her as though she was the most precious thing in his world, who was standing here now, making himself vulnerable in a way that must cost him dearly. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like freedom. "Yes, I'll allow you to court me." Edmund made a sound that might have been protest or resignation. "This is madness," he said. "Elouan, think about what you're doing. The scandal alone—" "Will fade," Theron interrupted. "I'm not without influence in society. Anyone who wishes to maintain connections with the Drakewell family will accept my choice of bride or find themselves on the outside looking in. I can protect her from the worst of the gossip. But can you protect her from yourself?" Edmund challenged, "from the possibility that this is just another way for your family to take something from mine?" "No," Theron admitted. "I can't prove my intentions beyond offering my actions as evidence. All I can tell you is that I would rather die than harm Elouan in any way. She has become the center of my world in a remarkably short time, and I intend to spend the rest of my life ensuring she never regrets choosing me." Edmund looked at his sister, really looked at her, and whatever he saw in her expression seemed to deflate his anger. "You're certain about this?" he asked quietly. Because once this path is chosen, there's no going back. You'll be Lady Drakewell, part of the family we've been taught to hate. Mother would be horrified. Our mother's been gone for 5 years, Elowen replied gently, and I think perhaps she would understand better than you imagine. She loved Father, even when he was consumed by bitterness over the feud. She knew what it was to love someone despite complications. I'm asking you to give me the same chance she had. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle visible on his face. Finally, he sighed, a sound of defeat and acceptance mingled together. I cannot stop you, and I suppose I wouldn't want to, seeing how determined you are. But I'm putting you on notice, Your Grace. If you hurt my sister, if you prove unworthy of the trust she's placing in you, feud or no feud, I will make it my life's work to destroy you. Duke or not, you'll find that the Valaharts can still be formidable enemies when properly motivated. I would expect nothing less, Theron replied. And I give you my word, though I know that means little given my family's history, that I will spend every day proving myself worthy of Elowen's faith in me. He opened the small box he had been holding, revealing a ring that made Elowen gasp. It was beautiful, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, the stone the exact color of a midnight sky. This belonged to Elizabeth Valehart Drakewell, Theron explained. I found it among my family's heirlooms after discovering the truth about our family's connection. It seemed right that it should return to a Valehart, if you'll accept it. The gesture's symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in the room. By offering his great-great-grandmother's ring, Theron was acknowledging the Valehart blood that ran through Drakewell veins was literally returning something that had been taken. It was both an apology and a promise. Elowen extended her hand, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. Theron slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, the sapphire catching the light and throwing blue shadows across her skin. It's perfect, she whispered. You're perfect, Theron replied, and the tenderness in his voice made her heart ache in the best possible way. Edmund cleared his throat. I suppose congratulations are in order, though the words feel strange on my tongue. When do you plan to make this official? Immediately, Theron said. I'll place announcements in all the relevant papers tomorrow. The ceremony itself can wait until you've had time to plan properly, Miss Valehart, but I want everyone to know that you are spoken for, that you are under my protection. The scandal will be immense, Edmund warned. People will talk, will speculate about motivations and appropriateness. Let them talk, Theron replied. They'll grow bored eventually, and those whose opinions matter will see that this union is based on genuine affection rather than strategy. In the meantime, I'll ensure that anyone who speaks ill of my intended regrets it. His words carried the weight of authority, a reminder that for all his professions of love, Theron Drakewell was still a duke with considerable power at his disposal. It was oddly comforting, knowing that he would wield that power in her defense. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. True to his word, Theron placed announcements in every major paper, and the reaction was everything Edmund had predicted, and worse. Society was scandalized, delighted, and deeply confused in equal measure. The prevailing theory seemed to be that the Duke had gone mad, or was engaged in some elaborate scheme that would eventually reveal itself. But Theron weathered the gossip with remarkable composure, appearing at every significant social event with Elowen on his arm, making it clear through his attentiveness and devotion that this was no political maneuvering, but genuine attachment. Slowly, public opinion began to shift. If the Duke of Blackridge was smitten with Elowen Valehart, then she must possess qualities worthy of such devotion, even if her family name carried less weight than others he might have chosen. Elowen found herself thrust into a social whirlwind she had never experienced before. As the Duke's intended, she was suddenly welcomed into circles that would never have acknowledged her existence previously. It was overwhelming and occasionally uncomfortable, particularly when she encountered people who made their skepticism about the match abundantly clear. But Theron was always there, a steady presence at her side, deflecting the worst of the barbs with aristocratic disdain that brooked no argument. She was also getting to know him better, to see beyond the formal exterior he presented to the world. She learned that he was an avid reader, with particular fondness for philosophy and history. She discovered that he had a dry sense of humor that revealed itself in unexpected moments, making her laugh when she least expected it. She found that he was generous with his tenants, far more so than was typical for landowners of his status, and that he took his responsibilities seriously, spending hours reviewing accounts and addressing concerns that many of his peers would have delegated entirely to stewards. But she also saw his darker moments, the times when the weight of his family's legacy seemed to crush down on him. He confided in her about the guilt he felt, knowing that his comfort and status were built on actions he found morally reprehensible. She held him through his doubts, reminded him that he was not his ancestors, that he had the power to write a different story for the Drakewell name. "I don't deserve you," he told her one evening as they walked through the Blackridge Gardens, the same gardens where they had first acknowledged their feelings. "You're too good, too pure for someone with as much darkness in their past as I carry." "Stop that," Elowen replied firmly. "You're not defined by what your family did before you were born. You're defined by what you choose to do now with the knowledge and power you have, and you're choosing to make amends to be better. That's what matters." "Is it enough?" he asked, and the vulnerability in his voice reminded her that beneath the ducal authority, he was just a man, plagued by the same doubts and fears as anyone else. "It's enough for me," she assured him, "and eventually it will be enough for you too." Their courtship, while unconventional in its origins, settled into something surprisingly traditional. Theron was scrupulous about maintaining propriety, always ensuring they were adequately chaperoned, never pushing for intimacies beyond what was appropriate for an engaged couple. It was simultaneously frustrating and endearing, this evidence that he truly did respect her and want to do things properly. The wedding was planned for spring, a season that felt appropriate for new beginnings. Elowen threw herself into preparations, grateful for the distraction from the ongoing social scrutiny. She selected her dress, planned the ceremony, coordinated with Theron's staff about how to merge their two households. It was all very normal, very ordinary, and yet every decision felt weighted with significance, as though she were not just planning a wedding, but constructing a bridge between two families that had been at war for generations. Edmund remained skeptical, but had softened somewhat as he witnessed Theron's devotion to Elowen. It was hard to maintain suspicion when faced with such obvious genuine affection. Still, he made a point of reminding Elowen regularly that she need only say the word and he would extract her from the engagement, consequences be damned. "I won't need extraction," Elowen told him after one such offer. "Edmund, I understand your concern, but you must let me make my own choices. I'm not a child, and I'm not naive about what I'm doing. I love Theron, and he loves me. That's not going to change." "Love isn't always enough," Edmund cautioned. "There are practical considerations, differences in status and expectations that can erode even the strongest affection." "Then we'll deal with those challenges as they arise," Elowen replied. "Together. That's what marriage is, isn't it? Facing difficulties as a united front rather than as isolated individuals." Edmund had no answer to that, and Elowen took his silence as acceptance, or at least resignation to the inevitable. But their path forward was not as smooth as Elowen might have hoped. A few weeks before the planned wedding, a new complication arose, one that threatened to undo all the progress they had made. It began with a letter, delivered to Theron at Blackridge Hall. Elowen was visiting that day, reviewing seating arrangements for the wedding breakfast, when she saw his expression change as he read, saw the colour drain from his face in a way that filled her with immediate dread. "What is it?" she asked, setting aside the papers she had been reviewing. Theron looked up at her, and the devastation in his eyes made her heart clench. "It's from my cousin, Marcus Drakewell. He's contesting the property settlements I made with your family." "Can he do that?" Elowen asked, moving to stand beside him. "Legally, yes," Theron replied, his voice tight with barely suppressed fury. "The properties I transferred to the Valaharts are technically part of the Drakewell-entailed estate. I should have obtained approval from the family trustees before making such a significant transfer. Marcus is arguing that I exceeded my authority, that the transfer was invalid." "But you were making restitution for what your family stole," Elowen protested. "He doesn't see it that way," Theron said bitterly. "To Marcus and others like him, I'm giving away Drakewell assets to appease outsiders, weakening the family's position for the sake of some misguided notion of justice. He's threatening to take legal action if I don't reverse the transfers. Elowen felt cold dread settling in her stomach. What does this mean for us? It means, Theron said heavily, that our engagement is going to be seen as even more suspicious than it already was. People will say I'm marrying you to maintain access to lands I can't legally give away, that the entire thing is a scheme to keep Valhart property under Drakewell control through marriage. He was right, Elowen realized with sick certainty. The timing was damning. If Theron reversed the transfers to placate his cousin, it would look as though he had never been sincere about making amends. But if he married her while the transfers were in dispute, it would appear as though the marriage was simply another method of securing what he wanted. We should postpone the wedding, Elowen heard herself saying, though the words felt like acid on her tongue. Until this is resolved, until there can be no question about motivations. No, Theron said immediately, reaching for her hands. Absolutely not. I won't let Marcus dictate our future. This is exactly what he wants, to create doubt, to drive a wedge between us. But the appearance, damn the appearance, Theron interrupted, his voice fierce. I love you, Elowen. That has nothing to do with property or strategy or family politics. I won't delay our marriage because my cousin is attempting to cause trouble. Then what do you propose? Elowen asked. Theron was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decision. I'll give Marcus what he wants. I'll reverse the property transfers. What? Elowen gasped. No, you can't. That would undo everything, would make my family victims all over again. Let me finish, Theron said gently. I'll reverse the transfers temporarily, long enough to satisfy the legal requirements and get Marcus off our backs. Then, after we're married, I'll transfer the properties directly to you as part of your marriage settlement. They'll be yours, completely and irrevocably, untouchable by Drakewell family politics. It's not ideal, and the delay will cause your brother considerable frustration, but it's the only way I can see to resolve this without compromising either our marriage or the restitution your family deserves. Elowen considered this, seeing the logic even as she hated the necessity. Edmund will be furious. Edmund will be furious regardless, Theron pointed out, but at least this way, he gets what he's owed in the end, even if the timing is delayed. And more importantly, there can be no question that our marriage is anything other than what it is, two people who love each other, choosing to build a life together. You're certain about this? Elowen asked. Giving up those properties, even temporarily, will weaken your position within your own family. I don't care about my position, Theron replied. I care about you, about us, about doing the right thing, even when it's difficult. If Marcus wants to view me as weak for prioritizing justice over dynasty, that's his prerogative. I know what matters, and it isn't the good opinion of a cousin whose moral compass is broken. Elowen felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by his willingness to sacrifice for her family, for principles that many in his position would have found convenient to ignore. I love you, she said, the words inadequate to express the depth of what she felt. And I love you, Theron replied, pulling her into his arms. Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what you told your brother, wasn't it? That marriage is about facing difficulties as a united front. So let's do that. Let's show Marcus and everyone else watching that we can't be divided, can't be manipulated or intimidated into abandoning what we know to be right. They told Edmund together, presenting the plan as a unified decision. As predicted, Edmund was angry, feeling betrayed by the reversal even though he understood the legal necessities forcing it. But Theron's promise to include the properties in Elowen's marriage settlement eventually mollified him, particularly when the Duke's solicitors drew up ironclad documents, ensuring the transfer would happen immediately following the wedding. You're playing a dangerous game, Edmund warned Theron, going against your own family like this, choosing us over them. I'm not choosing you over them, Theron corrected. I'm choosing what's right over what's convenient. There's a difference. The remaining weeks before the wedding were tense, with Marcus Drakewell making his displeasure known through a series of increasingly hostile letters and public statements that painted Theron as a traitor to his family name. Other Drakewells joined the criticism, creating a faction within the family that viewed the upcoming marriage as a disaster that needed to be prevented. Theron weathered it all with grim determination, refusing to be swayed by family pressure or social condemnation. But Elowen could see the toll it took on him, the way his shoulders grew tighter with each new attack, the exhaustion that crept into his features when he thought she wasn't looking. "We could still wait," she offered one evening a week before the wedding. "If this is too much, if the cost is too high—" "The cost of losing you would be higher," Theron interrupted. "Elowen, I need you to understand something. Before I met you, I was going through life on automatic, doing what was expected, maintaining the Drakewell name without really thinking about what that meant. You woke me up, made me question everything I had accepted as inevitable. I'm a better man because of you, and I refuse to give that up, because some members of my family are too stubborn to see past old prejudices. Even if it means becoming estranged from them." "Even then," Theron confirmed. "Though I hope it won't come to that. Eventually they'll see that this marriage strengthens rather than weakens our family, brings new perspectives and challenges old assumptions. And if they don't, if they choose to remain trapped in the past, then that's their loss, not mine." His certainty was a balm to Elowen's worried heart. She had been raised to value family above all else, had watched her own family's decline, and felt the weight of obligation that came with being a Veilheart. The idea of causing such division within Theron's family had troubled her deeply. But hearing him speak with such conviction, seeing his willingness to stand by his principles even when it was difficult, reinforced her faith in the choice they had made. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, as though nature itself was offering approval. Elowen dressed in her bridal finery, the white silk gown a symbol of new beginnings, the sapphire ring on her finger a reminder of old connections finally being honored. Martha helped arrange her veil, tears streaming down the maid's face as she stepped back to admire her mistress. "You look like an angel, Miss Elowen," Martha sniffed. "His Grace is a lucky man." "I'm the lucky one," Elowen replied, meaning it with her entire heart. The ceremony was held at the church that had served both the Drakewell and Veilheart families for generations, a neutral ground that seemed appropriate for a union meant to heal old wounds. As Elowen walked down the aisle on Edmund's arm, she saw Theron waiting at the altar, and the expression on his face took her breath away. He looked at her as though she were the answer to every question he had ever asked, as though the simple act of her existing was a gift beyond measure. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of vows and blessings, of words that bound them together legally and spiritually. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, when Theron lifted her veil and kissed her with a tenderness that made her soul sing, Elowen felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment, that every difficulty and doubt had been worth it to arrive here at this perfect beginning. The wedding breakfast that followed was a more subdued affair than might have been expected for a ducal marriage, with notably absent Drakewells creating gaps in the guest list that couldn't be ignored. But those who attended seemed genuinely happy for the couple, and if there were whispers about scandal and impropriety, they were drowned out by the overwhelming evidence of true affection between bride and groom. Edmund gave a toast that was surprisingly emotional, speaking of his sister's courage and the hope that this marriage represented not just for their two families, but for anyone willing to look past old grievances and choose connection over conflict. There wasn't a dry eye in the room when he finished, and even Theron looked suspiciously misty as he clasped Edmund's hand in thanks. The true test came later, during the weeks and months following the wedding. True to his word, Theron transferred the disputed properties to Elowen's name, ensuring that Valhart land was finally returned to Veilheart control. The legal maneuvering required was complex and expensive, but Theron navigated it with determination that brooked no interference. Marcus Drakewell and his faction were furious, declaring Theron unfit to lead the family and attempting to have him removed as the head of the Drakewell estate. It was a bitter fight, played out in solicitors' offices and family meetings that grew increasingly hostile. Elowen watched her husband weather these attacks with growing admiration, seeing how he refused to compromise his principles even when it would have been easier to give in. The fight climaxed in a family meeting that Elowen was not permitted to attend, but which Theron recounted to her that evening with exhausted satisfaction. "I laid it all out for them," he told her, as they sat together in the drawing room of their London townhouse, a property that had become their retreat from both Blackridge and Valehart Manor, neutral territory where they could simply be husband and wife without the weight of family expectations. "Every document, every piece of evidence of what our ancestors did, I made them look at the truth they've been avoiding for generations." "How did they respond?" Elowen asked, though she suspected she already knew. "About half of them were horrified, genuinely shocked to learn the full extent of the original theft," Theron replied. "The other half, including Marcus, tried to argue that it didn't matter, that we shouldn't be held responsible for actions taken generations ago. So I asked them a simple question. If we're not responsible for correcting past wrongs, then what is the Drakewell legacy worth? Is it just the accumulation of wealth and property, or does it mean something more? Should we be remembered as the family that took what wasn't theirs and never made it right, or as the family that had the courage to acknowledge mistakes and attempt restitution?" "That must have struck a nerve," Elowen observed. "It did," Theron confirmed with grim satisfaction, "particularly with the younger generation. My nephews and nieces, the ones who will inherit this mess we've created, they understood immediately. They don't want to build their lives on stolen foundations any more than I do." By the end of the meeting, Marcus was isolated, his supporters dwindling as people realized they were defending the indefensible. So it's over? Elowen asked hopefully. "Not entirely," Theron admitted. "Marcus will continue to be a thorn in my side, will probably spend the rest of his life bitter about what he sees as my betrayal. But his power to actually interfere is significantly diminished. The family has voted to support the property transfers and to officially acknowledge the historical wrongs committed against the Valaharts. It's not everything, but it's a start." Elowen moved closer to him, taking his hand in hers. "I'm proud of you. What you did, standing up to your entire family, it took remarkable courage." "I had remarkable motivation," Theron replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "You, our future children, the possibility of building something better than what we inherited, that's worth fighting for." Their first child arrived the following spring, a daughter they named Elizabeth after the Valehart woman who had unwittingly connected their two families generations earlier. She had her mother's auburn hair and her father's grey eyes, and from her first breath she was adored by both sides of her family, a living symbol of the peace that had finally been achieved. Edmund was a devoted uncle, visiting frequently and showing a tenderness with the baby that surprised everyone who knew him. "She's a fresh start," he told Elowen during one visit, holding his niece with surprising competence. "Neither Valehart nor Drakewell exclusively, but something new. Perhaps that's how it should be, letting go of these old names and the baggage they carry." "You're becoming quite philosophical in your old age," Elowen teased. "I'm hardly old," Edmund protested, "but fatherhood apparently makes men contemplative, or so I'm told." He had recently announced his own engagement to the daughter of a neighboring family, a match based on genuine affection rather than strategic alliance, and Elowen suspected that his changed perspective had more to do with his impending marriage than with his niece's arrival. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Theron proved to be everything Elowen had believed he could be, a devoted husband, an engaged father, and a duke who took seriously the responsibility of using his position for good. He implemented reforms across his estates, improved conditions for his tenants, and became known as a voice for progressive causes in Parliament. The Drakewell name, once synonymous with pride and ruthlessness, began to acquire new associations: fairness, integrity, and the willingness to acknowledge past mistakes. The Valehart fortunes improved as well, bolstered by the return of ancestral lands and by Theron's advice on investments and estate management. Edmund proved surprisingly adept at business, once freed from the burden of maintaining pointless feuds, and the Valehart name began to recover some of its former luster. But the greatest change was in the way the two families interacted. What had once been hostile avoidance transformed into genuine connection. Holidays were celebrated jointly, with Drakewells and Valeharts mingling with an ease that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The younger generation, Elizabeth and the children that followed her, grew up knowing both families as simply family, without the divisions that had defined their parents' and grandparents' lives. There were still challenges, of course. Marcus Drakewell never fully reconciled with Theron, choosing to maintain his bitter disapproval until his death. Some members of society continued to view the Drakewell-Valahart union with suspicion, convinced there must be some hidden agenda beneath the surface. And there were moments when the weight of what they had undertaken felt overwhelming, when Elowen and Theron questioned whether they had made the right choices. But in those moments of doubt, they would remember that day in the garden at Blackridge Hall, when they had first acknowledged the impossible thing growing between them. They would recall the courage it had taken to choose each other, despite all the reasons they shouldn't, the faith they had placed in something as intangible as love being enough to overcome historical animosity. And they would look at their children, at the family they had built, at the peace they had fought for and won, and know that every difficulty had been worth it. They had inherited a war and chosen to create a peace, had been handed hatred and transformed it into love, had taken broken legacies and rebuilt them into something stronger. Years later, when their grandchildren asked about the feud between the Drakewells and the Valeharts, Elowen and Theron would tell them the story honestly, not shying away from the painful parts or the mistakes that had been made. They would explain how easy it is to inherit anger, to let the grudges of previous generations dictate the present, to choose the safety of familiar hostility over the risk of vulnerable connection. But they would also tell them about the courage it takes to break those cycles, to look past the labels and see the person beneath, to choose love even when everything suggests it's the wrong choice. They would talk about how their grandmother had stood at a window and watched a duke ride up to her family's home expecting confrontation and had instead found connection, about how their grandfather had come seeking to right an historical wrong and had discovered something far more valuable than justice. He had found a partner who would challenge him to be better than his legacy demanded. The story would always end the same way, with Elowen and Theron holding hands, their fingers intertwined in a gesture that had become second nature over their years together, and saying in unison, "We were supposed to be enemies. Instead, we chose to be everything." And their grandchildren, seeing the love that still burned bright between these two people, who had rewritten destiny through sheer determination and faith in each other, would understand that some of the most powerful acts of courage happen not on battlefields or in grand public gestures, but in the quiet moments when two people look at each other and decide that the future they could build together is worth more than the past they've been handed. The Drakewell-Valehart feud became, in time, a cautionary tale about the cost of holding grudges and the corrosive nature of unexamined hatred. But it also became a love story, proof that even the deepest divides can be bridged by two people willing to take the first terrifying step toward each other, to reach across the chasm that separates enemy from beloved and say, "I choose you. Despite everything, I choose you." Theron had expected a battle when he rode to Valahart Manor that fateful morning. He had armed himself with documents and arguments, had prepared for hostility and resistance. Instead, he had found Elowen, and she had disarmed him completely with nothing more than her presence, her intelligence, her refusal to accept the limitations that others tried to place on her heart. She had been the woman worth fighting for, worth risking everything for, worth rebuilding an entire family legacy for. And Theron spent the rest of his life grateful that fate, in its infinite wisdom, had led him to her door when he least expected it, transforming what should have been just another skirmish in an endless war into the beginning of a love story that would be remembered long after both of them were gone. In the end, they proved that love is not just a feeling but a choice, made over and over again in the face of opposition and doubt. They demonstrated that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. They showed that legacy is not something fixed and unchangeable, but something that can be reshaped by each generation willing to question what they've inherited and choose something better. The Duke had expected a battle. Instead, he found a woman who would stand beside him and fight for something far more important. A future built on love rather than hatred, connection rather than division, hope rather than bitterness. And together, They won a victory more significant than any that could be achieved through conflict, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply choosing to love across the boundaries that are meant to keep us apart. Their story became legend, passed down through generations as both warning and inspiration. It reminded people that feuds, once started, can consume families for lifetimes if left unchallenged. But it also reminded them that at any moment, someone can choose to step off that well-worn path of hatred and forge a new trail toward reconciliation and love. Theron and Elowen Drakewell lived long, full lives surrounded by children and grandchildren who never knew what it was like to hate based on family name. They transformed Blackridge Hall from a symbol of Drakewell supremacy into a home filled with warmth and welcome, where Valharts were as comfortable as Drakewells, and no distinction was made between the two lineages. They proved that one couple, through determination and authentic love, could rewrite the narrative of two entire families. And when they finally passed, within days of each other as if neither could bear to exist without the other, they left behind more than property or titles or wealth. They left a legacy of choosing courage over comfort, love over loyalty to old grudges, and hope over the kind of bitter resignation that had characterized their families for far too long. They left proof that the walls we build between ourselves and others are never as immutable as they seem, that any divide can be crossed by someone brave enough to take the first step. The Duke had expected a battle. He found a woman worth fighting for, and in loving her, in choosing her despite every reason he shouldn't, he found himself, found purpose, found redemption for a family name that had been tarnished by greed and pride. Elowen had been the catalyst for transformation, the one person who could look at Theron Drakewell and see not a title or a legacy, but simply a man capable of being more than his ancestors had been. Together, they had turned expectation into possibility, hatred into love, and an ending into a beginning, Their story concluded not with the triumph of one family over another, but with the creation of something entirely new, a merged legacy built on the best of both names, a future where old wrongs were acknowledged and corrected, and a love that had been strong enough to weather every storm, precisely because it had never been the easy choice, only the right one. And so the tale of the Duke of Blackridge and Elowen Valehart passed into history, a reminder that love, real love, requires more than passion. It requires courage, commitment, the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, and the strength to stand firm when everyone tells you you're wrong. But for those brave enough to pay that price, the reward is immeasurable. A love that transforms not just two lives, but entire legacies, echoing through generations and proving that the most powerful force in the world is not hatred or pride or the weight of history, but two hearts that refuse to be divided by anything lesser than death itself. Dear listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this journey through love, courage, and the power of choosing connection over conflict. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours in creating it for you, we would be so grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe to Echoes of Romance. Your subscription helps us continue bringing you beautiful love stories that remind us all of the transformative power of authentic connection. Please leave us a comment sharing your thoughts about Theron and Elowen's journey. We absolutely love hearing from you and learning which moments resonated most deeply with your heart. And if you enjoyed this tale, a like would mean the world to us and helps other romance lovers discover these stories. Don't forget to activate your notifications so you never miss a new story from Echoes of Romance. We have so many more beautiful, emotional journeys to share with you, each one a reminder that love, in all its complicated glory, is always worth fighting for. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, may you have the courage to choose love even when it's the hardest choice to make. With love and gratitude, Echoes of Romance.